and welcome to everyone. My name is Mark Rincon. I'm with the Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training. We're pleased to have you here. This is a collaborative effort between ADST, the Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training, and DACOR, and this is part of the Diplomats and Diplomacy Book Series. So today we're very pleased to help us get started. Before we're going to have a brief welcome as well, I believe, from our colleague from DACOR, Miss Angela Dickey. So Angela, I'll pass it to you if you'd like to say a few things.
Thank you so much. I'm Angela from DACOR. I'm the new vice president, and it's a great honor for me to participate today in this program. In the run-up, in the last few minutes, I've observed that I'm a witness to a great gathering of old friends who have gathered here to remember Ambassador Stearns and to talk about his book, his last book. And I just feel so honored. DACOR and ADST have a long relationship, and a long relationship with these book launches. But also, if you didn't know, ADST was an outgrowth of early DACOR efforts to record oral histories. So these organizations are very closely linked, and I'm proud to be a member of both of them. And I am so proud to be here today and to convey welcome from DACOR. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angela. That is excellent. And of course, thank you to all of you who are attending. This is, for your patience, this is our first virtual book launch. And ideally, we would be together with the reception in person. But of course, we're trying to do this virtually. So thank you for your kindness in attending. And one final reminder, we will be recording our discussion today and sharing it via ADST's YouTube channel. After we get the recording done and posted, we can follow up and send a link to that, which will be available on ADST.org website. So today we're discussing, of course, late Ambassador Monteagle Stearns' book, Gifted Greek, the enigma of Andreas Papandreou, with two people who are close to him and near and dear to the book. So I just wanted to say a quick word before we get started. First, we're joined by Professor Constantine Arvanitopoulos, who's the Karan Manlis Chair in Hellenic and European Studies at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. The professor he's a former Greek Minister of Education. He's a graduate of Pantheon University, and he holds an MA and a PhD in International Relations from the School of International Service at American University in Washington, D.C. In addition, we have Antonia, Tony Stearns, Monty's widow, and she was a true partner in diplomacy as a U.S. Foreign Service spouse throughout her and Monty's diplomatic postings abroad, 3 times of which they were in Greece. She's an accomplished writer herself, and she will also share her unique perspective and the role completing and publishing Gifted Greek. So I'm sure we're in for an insightful discussion, and I'd like to invite Professor Constantine to open the conversation, followed by Tony Stearns. And again, as we have this discussion, think of your questions, put them in the chat box, or raise your hand after the initial presentations, and we will get to that. So over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Mark. And I want to thank the organizers and also my good friend, Tony Stearns, for giving me the distinct honor and the privilege to present the book of late Monteagle Stearns. That I was fortunate enough to have met him and to consider him as one of my mentors in international relations and diplomatic studies. I met Monty in between 1990 and 1992. I had just completed my dissertation on Greece's transition to democracy, and I was doing my postdoctoral at the Center for European Studies at Harvard. And I remember talking about Greece and his keen interest in the Byzantine Greek politics, and we had a few lunches at the Harvard Faculty Club, but more importantly, I was able to profit from his deep knowledge of world affairs and his ethos and decency. Actually, this is a fascinating book by what I consider one of the best and brightest of American diplomacy. It is a book that was published, of course, after his death due to the dedication and persistence of his wife, Toni Stearns. And it was not an easy task. And I can attest to that, having experienced firsthand her valiant efforts in trying to complete the manuscript and edit it and publish it. Now, this book includes actually many narratives. The first, at least in part, is an autobiographical narrative. It is about Monti's sequential posts to Greece. They are all, of course, in the context of the Cold War. They are in post-war, in post-Civil War Greece, the turbulent years before the dictatorship of the Greek colonels, and finally, post-dictatorship democratic Greece, with Monty Stearns trying to strike a balance between Papandreou's knack for hyperbole and anti-systemic and populist rhetoric on the one hand, and the no-nonsense government of Ronald Reagan at the apex of the Cold War on the other hand. And we all know that Monty managed to do this job and this tight balancing act quite effectively. Now, his look on Greece is a measured and fair look. It is not an emperor's look walking at his provinces. I would dare to say that Monty Stearns has quite an empathy, a very empathetic perspective on Greece's efforts to come out of the Civil War, to come out of poverty, and to resolve its security challenges. He has an empathy not only as an ambassador coming from an allied country, but allow me to say that he has an empathy as a friend of Greece. Always, of course, in the context of promoting the national interest of his country. But he did it with such a pragmatism and with such subtlety that presupposes a deep understanding of Greece's history, of Greece's culture, and its Byzantine politics. In the end, Monty succeeded in being equally effective for promoting US interests and being one of the very few American ambassadors in Athens that has been widely respected and liked in Greece. Now, the second narrative has to do with the very charismatic and contradictory political figure of Andreas Papandreou. Andreas poses sort of an enigma for Monty Stearns, as Monty reveals from the title that he chose for the book. On the one hand, he has great respect and admiration for this brilliant American educated Greek that impersonated the epitome of the American dream. Andreas came to the United States without money or friends and managed through hard work to climb to the top of America's highest educational institutions, from Harvard to Minnesota to eventually becoming the chairman of the Department of Economics at Berkeley. Monty gives a very good account of this difficult path, of this difficult part of Andreas' life, but of a very successful life in America. On the other hand, this liberal cosmopolitan American goes through something like a complete metamorphosis, according to Monty Stearns, when he returns to Greece to get involved into politics, and turns to a very impatient socialist populist with a fiery anti-systemic rhetoric that creates shockwaves in Greek politics. At one point, as Monty writes in his book, even his father, George Papandreou, who was the prime minister at the time, confessed about Andreas's rhetoric. Why is he talking about overthrowing the establishment? Doesn't he understand that I am the establishment? So Stearns tries to trace and analyze this very complex and difficult relationship between father and son. He goes all the way back to examine his father's divorce, the impact that this had on Andreas Papandreou with George Papandreou's abandonment of his mother and the family home, up to their final political clash. It is, he concludes, a relationship of trust, love, and respect, but it's a relationship between two people that come from two entirely different worlds. Now, the third narrative in Monty Stearns' book has to do with the turbulent politics of post-war Greece. He describes brilliantly the heavy involvement of the crown in everyday politics, as well as the involvement of the Greek armed forces at the time, and also the heavy American footprint following the Civil War and within the context of the Cold War. Now, center stage, but in a very subtle subtext in this narrative, is another giant Greek political figure, Constantine Karamanlis. Stearns is not close to Karamanlis. Actually, Karamanlis was notorious of being very distant with everybody, but he shows respect for Karamanlis. Karamanlis, he says, had the political savvy and the discipline to know when and how to keep a safe distance from the crown, the ultra-right, and the Americans. He understood that the Greek politics was subject to the wider great power of politics of the Cold War, and he was very methodical and pragmatic to maintain balance in both these chessboards and keep himself in power. Now, Monty offers in his book invaluable insights about the relationship of the two men, Karamanlis and Papandreou, especially tracing the 1958, but more importantly, the 1961 elections. Especially on the 1961 election, Monty makes a very important point. He claims that Andreas's bombastic rhetoric and his and the Center Union's unfounded allegations about wide fraud in the elections escalated the political conflict in Greece to a level that could not be easily absorbed by the feeble institutional nexus of post-war Greek democracy. And Stearns makes the point that in a country with very strong institutions, with social mobility, maybe this is easier to happen and all this rhetoric to be absorbed. But this was not the case in Greece at the time. Now, Stearns makes his final round in Greece as full ambassador in 1981. And his posting coincides with Andreas's meteoric rise to power in 1981. This is after the transition to democracy has been completed. And Monty writes about the hard work done by Karamanlis in making the transition smoothly and consolidating democratic institutions, writing a new constitution and getting Greece into Europe. But the time had come for a change, αλλαγή. And Athens was delirious at the time with the change to socialism. But Washington was at the apex of the Cold War, and deviations from the Western orthodoxy could not be easily swallowed. Actually, there is an anecdote that is widely circulated in Greece even today, which goes that at some point, and I don't know actually if this holds true, but it's an interesting anecdote, and it goes something like this: that at some point, especially after the incident of the Korean jumbo airliner, and Andreas's deviation from Western Orthodoxy when it came to making comments about the incident. Monty was summoned to Washington, and at some point he went to the White House, and Reagan supposedly asked him, well, what does this Papa something want down there? And Monty responded, don't listen to what he says, look at what he does. And whether this anecdote is true or false, the events proved that, and Stern brilliantly describes the gradual abandonment by Andreas Papandreou of his extremic rhetoric about a Grexit from NATO and the European Union to more pragmatic positions, while at the same time, Karamanlis's presence at the presidency of the Republic and this cohabitation acted as a guarantee for Greece's Western orientation. Now, this cohabitation was disrupted in 1985, and that's another very interesting story described by Tony Stearns' book. Andreas had publicly proclaimed that his party would support Karamanlis for a second term, and he would reassure everybody privately, including Stearns, that he would do so. And of course, he didn't. And Stearns watched dumbstruck the unfolding of events. And as he writes in the book, he could not understand why Andreas had misled him. He says, he could have simply said nothing, he writes in his book, instead of misleading me. Now, his final verdict, and I will end my brief remarks with that, and I will be happy to entertain any questions from this distinguished audience. His final verdict of Andreas is a mixed one. He does not doubt for a minute his socialist idealism for a more equal and just society. And I think he gives credit to Andreas Papandreou that he contributed to the national reconciliation after the Cold War, especially after the transition of democracy. This was still something that was a political issue. And also, he deepened the social welfare system and contributed to greater social cohesion in Greece. I think he also respects his academic career. He accepts Andreas's charisma and his leadership qualities. The point that he makes that is very critical of Andreas, however, is when it comes to his inability or unwillingness to implement the much needed structural reforms and his inability or unwillingness to eradicate this clientelistic network in Greek politics. I think overall, the book is a fair but critical assessment of a very important post-war Greek political figure. And I think it offers invaluable insights, as I said, into Greek post-war politics. He does it with empathy, but in a measured way, and I think in a way that is very helpful if read by many Greek politicians that need to draw the necessary conclusions from a very fresh, objective look into Greek politics. And I think for one last time, we are indebted to Tony that had all the love, the patience, and the resilience to give us this wonderful book. And I encourage everyone to buy. It's a very, very well-written book, by the way. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for those remarks. I'd like to pass the floor to Tony, if you'd like to say a few words before we get to discussion and questions.
Yes, if you would like me to, yes, talk first. Please. And then we can move on to any questions.
Thank you.
Constantine, thank you so much for having penetrated so accurately just what Monty was trying to do. My part in this book wasn't so much writing any of it as putting it in order. Monty died, and he had planned to add a few more chapters, and that's why it is a slender book. Those chapters were to be on Papandreou's second term and then his partially completed third term. He was too ill and too tired and too blind. And in the end, he concluded that he would cover only those 30 years that we knew him, and that this wasn't going to be a book with a day-to-day, hour-by-hour study of the socialist movement and its coming into power. So it ends with Monty seeing him for the last time in the early 1990s, but we had left Greece 5 or 6 years earlier. So I put into the introduction and the epilogue Monty's comments about what Papandreou tried to do and whether he actually managed to do it. These are just thoughts that he and I talked about a lot, but I didn't have any hard copy on it. So these are my words, which I think are very, very accurate in summing up Monty's own thoughts. The other point that I wish to make is that he had wanted very much to combine a personal memoir with a character study of a man who was always something of a mystery to us, and possibly something of a mystery to himself. And so the first few chapters deal with Papandreou's youth. And Monty spent a lot of time reading his schoolwork, reading his poetry, reading his Harvard thesis, reading his first wife's book, which was actually written in English, translated by pirates into Greek, and then quashed immediately. Monty found a Greek version of it, but knowing that it had been written in English, it kind of garbled the whole kind of water. So here too, he, I think, tried to be very fair in treating Christina's version of her marriage. At any rate, that takes you up through Papandreou's childhood, youth, and first marriage. We met him after he was married to his second wife, Margaret, who was 100% American. And when we met in 1959, Monty and I had been recently married. Andreas had come to spend an academic year in Athens at the invitation of the conservative government under Constantine to study the Greek economy and what might be done to strengthen it. We were neighbors, accidentally, and friends. And to us, the two Papandreous, we called them Andy and Maggie, were fellow Americans. And this is how we first came to know them. And it was only as time went on, mostly in the 1961 contested election, when we saw Papandreou's vehement reactions and a kind of loyalty to his father, whom he had been very critical of prior to that. So the plot thickens, excuse me, and I think that it makes for a very interesting personal tale, both of Greek politics and the Greek psyche. And I think that's what I tried to keep as much as I could in this book. Monty and I talked about it endlessly. And I think that it comes through, at least I certainly hope so, and that leaving it at the end of Papandreou's second term, at the end of 1985, was the most logical place, because that rounded the arc that had started in 1959. And it was an almost 30-year span in which we saw this man both as a friend, as an adversary, as a Greek, and as an American. Hence Monty's title. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. That is a very unique perspective. And I think now we can go to questions, comments from the group. We have a hand raised from T. Miller's iPhone. If we can unmute or ask you to unmute, you're welcome to ask your question, please.
It's Mark. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, go right ahead.
Okay, Mark, this is T. Miller, is married to Bonnie Miller. So,
excellent.
Tony, greetings from Tom and Bonnie. My question is really for Tony, and it's more related to your conversations with Monty after 1985. Just by background, as Tony remembers, Bonnie and I arrived in Athens near the end of Monty's term as ambassador. I was a political officer. And I later, just like Monty, went back as DCM and ambassador over the next 20 years. My question is really Andreas Papandreou, the enigma. He seemed, when I was charge in the mid 90s, and we did the Macedonia, everything but the name issue and a bunch of other things. And I had a certain amount of dealings with him. He seemed like a very, very different person. He was sick. He was tired. He knew that he wasn't going to be on this earth much longer. Yeah. And I'm just wondering, I'd like to get your comment, Tony, on your conversations with Monty in this later period. Were there two Andreas Papandreous? The one in the 80s, 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s was a guy who was very politically motivated and everything else. I think by the 90s, in his last years, he seemed tired, but kind of more with an eye on his point in history. And so I'd like to just get your comments on your conversations with Monty and kind of the contrast between the two Papandreous.
There certainly was. Monty saw him last in 1993 on a swing through Greece, and he went and called on him in his pink villa. He was married to his third wife then. And there were cartoons in Greece of his new wife, Dimitra, who was extremely buxom, and Andreas, who was bedridden with an oxygen tank. And the cartoon showed the oxygen tank as one of Dimitra's breasts and herself as the other one, that she was keeping him going. And I think that he was sick. He had been a chain smoker. He had not taken care of his health. He was only in his late 70s when he died, and he looked 90. That was the last time Monty saw him, and after that trip, he told me that he thought that it was over. Andreas was absolutely washed up, and indeed, he died, I think, in 1996. And he had stepped down. this was indeed a very different man from the early 80s, when he really came into power in triumph. And although he was never healthy, Andreas had bouts of illness, depression, periods when he seemed a little off. And even then, Monty wondered if he had perhaps used up a little more of his time than would normally be the case, because it had been such a frantic time for him ever since he had been thrown into prison in April of 1967. And so he had been a healthy, happy, active man in the late 1950s, a very engaged man in the 1960s, a quite angry man in the 1970s, and a man who had reached the pinnacle in the 1980s, but was a little bit bored at having to actually run things. I think he functioned better as the opposition, as do many Greek parties and many Greek politicians. It is so easy to be anti, and it's terribly hard to actually step up to the plate and take care of all these issues. So yes, he had changed enormously. He certainly aged. In the late 50s, he just looked terrific. He really did. By the 90s, he was a very frail and old man. And that is what you saw, Tom. And I'm curious to know whether or not you had many dealings with him, or was he too ill?
Well, I was DCMing for a while, chargé. So my dealings with him were not extensive. I spent a day with him at the Pink Palace when we were negotiating the Macedonia issue. And I mean, literally 6 hours or so there, and with Dimitra waiting. So, but, you know, and I saw him occasionally, off and on. He was extremely frail, and his voice was very faint. You had to lean forward to listen to him. And, you know, of course, when I served in that short brief period of time with you and Monty, I had no dealings with him. You know, I was just a mere political officer. But he, and you know, I think I really identify with what you said, Tony, about he liked the chase more than the results sometimes. And loved, you know, he first came back as prime minister in 1981, which was the start of Monty's tenure as ambassador. And that was probably his high point, you know, as a politician. But by the time I was DCM / chargé, he was just he looked like a cadaver, really, frankly.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Miller, for that question and that insight as well. It's very interesting, the personal experience and the connection with those of us who served in Greece. We have another question from a Catherine. I believe it's Catherine Ingmanson.
Yes,
sorry.
Actually, it's Alex Karayanis.
Alex, I'm sorry.
It's on
Go
my
ahead.
wife's computer.
Please go ahead.
So it's good to see everyone again.
Hello.
I guess my question is, to what, both for the professor and for Tony, to what degree do you ascribe Papandreou's politics as ones of rebellion and, you know, political expediency as opposed to personal, especially given his escape from Greece during and after the junta, and whether that influenced him to take a more radical stance, and whether Margaret, of course, this is all speculative, whether his time in Minnesota and progressivism influences political orientation. And, you know, was he a rebel against his father and against Karamanlis to set his own legacy? Was that part of his motivation?
Constantine, do you want to tackle it first?
You can go first, and then I can follow up.
Okay. I think that he was all of those. I think that when he went to Minnesota, met and married Margaret, that his Trotskyite youth had a chance to come back up to surface, because he had hidden it well during the years that he was at Harvard. Monty spent a long time analyzing his PhD thesis there, because it really shows absolutely no sign of a Marxist, of a Trotskyite, and he was playing to the conservative crowd. And when he got to Minnesota and he met people like Orville Freeman, Hubert Humphrey, and others, I think that he felt freer. And he then realized that there was a liberal wing, progressive wing, in the Farmer and Labor Party in Minnesota. And I think that that gave him a chance. Maggie certainly was part of that. And I think they just became a very attractive, well-known, younger couple. They were in their early 30s. And I think that they just joined into that wing of the Democratic Party.
Yeah, I can just add a couple of points. I think that his relationship with his father was a complex one. And the same goes for his relationship with Karamanlis. I think that he respected both of them, but he begged to differ. I mean, he was coming from an entirely different viewpoint. I think also his two experiences, the first one with the Metaxa dictatorship and the second one, his arrest by the colonels, were traumatic experiences. But having said that, I think that he was a socialist. He was a socialist democrat for European politics, as we consider them within the context of European politics. And I think he got up on a couple of issues that were very important. The first thing had to do with decreasing inequalities and bringing about a more just and equal society. I think that was one of his deep beliefs. And the second one was the deepening of democracy, together with decentralizing politics. I think that was another belief. I think that he was convinced that the time had come for a change, for the deepening of democracy. Having experienced the Metaxa regime, the colonels, and so on and so forth, I think these were two deep beliefs that he held. I think all his, and then he coupled that with the flair of populism, of course, because he was a very skillful orator, and I think, Greek politics and Greek culture always suffers from a great deal of populism. He indulged into populist rhetoric. Now, as far as his anti-Western kind of rhetoric, I think it was more of a reaction to the dictatorship and a call for more sovereign independence and so on and so forth, and a tactic to take voters from the left. And this is why, in that respect, you saw a transformation to more pragmatic politics by abandoning the Grexit claims from NATO and the EU, and eventually signing the defense agreement with the United States, of course, under the pretext that the bases are going, but the bases stayed, because it was essential, he felt, for the popular mood of the time in the post-dictatorship era. But I think that was more rhetorical rather than real. At the same time, he left his cosmopolitanism for a more nationalistic posturing, especially when it came to Greek-Turkish differences. He had a more nationalist posturing. And the final comment has to do with the discussion that Ambassador Miller had with Tony Stearns before a minute ago. I think I would fully agree that in his final term in office, he was very concerned with his legacy. And that was reflected in the economic policies that he implemented. He was concerned with public debt. He was concerned with the deficit. He said the famous phrase that if we don't eliminate the debt will eliminate us. And he sort of implemented a more austere politics. So he became very concerned with his legacy. And I think he was a different Andreas, not only in style and rhetoric, but also in policies. And he also became very concerned with European politics. The fact that the European project, according to his view, was taking the wrong turn. So I think that he was a true socialist from the beginning to the end, but in certain issues he made the essential compromise. And I will also fully agree that he was more comfortable in being in opposition rather than in government.
Excellent. I'm wondering if I could take a point of privilege to follow up, to ask a question regarding, so the book itself, Gifted Greek, it's very well researched, clearly, but it's not an academic treatise. It's not, it doesn't go too deep. Yet it's a very human story, and I think coming from that experience of dealing with a complex man, a contradictory life, these differences between two cultures, I wanted to ask both you, Professor, and Tony, what your thoughts are on the role of Papandreou's dual nationality and the identity, a dual identity, being Greek-American or American-Greek. What do you think that played in how history unfolded? And in addition to that, sort of the relationship with his father, we have a comment that just came out in the chat about sort of his father and reaction to seeing him as a junior, both initially as an ally and then as an adversary. Would you care to comment on either of those 2 points, please?
You want me to go first?
Please.
Well, I think when one talks about the word Greek American, usually one is speaking of an immigrant, and he was not an immigrant. Andreas was an exile, and he had arrived in the summer of 1940. Hitler was overrunning Europe at that point. Greece was not yet in it, but it was about to be invaded by Italy in the fall. Andreas was in trouble with the Greek military dictatorship, and he left because he had been thrown into jail, possibly tortured. We aren't ever absolutely sure about that. He claimed that his jaw had been broken. And with his father's blessing, he was told to sort of get out of town. And so he hadn't ever gone through the kind of life that the Greek immigrant has. He did have a few ties, mostly because of George Papandreou's wife, the actress Kiveli. She had family in New York, so he had a place to go. And he had applied to Columbia and then to Harvard, both of which took him readily. And when he stepped off the boat in June of 1940, he proclaimed himself a political refugee. And that was taken at face value. I don't know if anybody else was helping him, but he didn't have any trouble getting into the States. And he didn't have any trouble going to Columbia and then to Harvard. So I think he had some help. And he came from a prominent family. And in a way, this was like taking in the son of, say, Churchill or somebody like that. He didn't have any difficulties. And then as he rose through the academic ranks, he really became more and more Americanized. And he seemed to have cast off all of his Greek conflicts, Greek roots, problems with his father. He just moved farther and farther out of Greece's past. And I think that that was a hidden trauma.
Yeah, a couple of comments, if I may. The first has to do with the book itself. You mentioned that it's not an academic book. It's written in a wonderful prose, and it's based on personal experiences and reflections. But at the same time, it's not just about writing about his reflections or about Andreas and his knowledge of Andreas. Monty Stearns goes very deep into his understanding of Greek politics, Greek institutions, Greek culture, and gives us a lot of hints about structural, institutional factors that played an important role in the in Greek politics. So I would say that it's a very important book. It's written in a very beautiful prose, but at the same time, it has invaluable insights, deep insights that I was very impressed with. Now, regarding Andreas's dual citizenship, I think that one comment has to do with the fact that Andreas was an adaptive personality.
Yeah.
We should not get the sense that he was some rigid, inflexible politician. He was a very adaptive personality. Yeah. His opponents used to say that he's a political chameleon. That's probably a negative statement, but Andreas was an adaptive personality. Yes, I agree with Tony that he went into the best American institutions, perhaps in part because he was a prime minister's son, but we all know that a PhD at Harvard is not an easy task, and it doesn't come easy. And he had to work hard, and he proved himself. And some of his books are important books, and they were considered important books at the time. And this is why he landed a very prestigious job at Berkeley. And he was very well considered in the academic community of American economists. All the biggies signed the letter asking the colonels to release him. All the academic community got together because of the respect that they had for Andreas's academic work. We shouldn't downplay that. Now, it is my feeling, I have the feeling, I cannot back it by evidence, but I have the feeling that when he got involved into Greek politics, the fact that he had been previously an American citizen, he had served in the US Navy, perhaps led him to just up his rhetoric a click more, just to prove to the doubter that I'm a real Greek.
Yeah.
This is a personal feeling that I have, that he was trying somehow to neutralize this perception that he thought some in Greece, some voters in Greece might have. So part of his extremist rhetoric perhaps had to do with a need to prove that he was more Greek than the Greeks and more perhaps anti-American than some of the left.
I couldn't agree more. Absolutely.
Thank you for that. That's fascinating. We have a hand raised by Mr. Allen. Allen, if you'd like to ask your question, please go right ahead.
Yes, thank you, Tony and Constantine, for this marvelous discussion of this wonderful biography, which I look forward to reading. Constantine, your mention of the bases agreement, the defense agreement between Greece and the United States reminds me of a discussion in my class in diplomacy at the Flichter School when both Monty and Tony Stearns came as guest speakers. And Monty, as I recall, and your remark prompted this recollection, discussed that agreement, that bases agreement, which you described as the bases are going, but the bases stay.
Right.
As an example of diplomatic constructive ambiguity. I mean, Monty himself was a master of diplomacy, wrote one of the very best books on diplomacy by anybody in recent years, Talking with Strangers. But I wonder whether that formula that was worked out, which was not only a diplomatic formula, but it was a political formula that seems to have been acceptable in Greek politics at the time. I mean, that must have been a wonderful combination of diplomatic craft and political, as you said, adaptiveness. And it was accepted, it worked temporarily, but diplomacy tends to be a temporary solution to problems rather than a permanent one anyway.
Right.
Just a comment. And thank you, Tony. I will remember your remarks as well. You talked about courtesy and curiosity as being essentials to diplomacy at that time, and we all remember that very well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor Henriksson, if you allow me to comment on that, I think that both the United States and Greece were very fortunate that Monteagle Stearns was at the helm of the American embassy in the 80s. Because, as I said before, he acted with such pragmatism and subtlety, and he gave the room, the space for Andreas to backtrack from his pre-election promises, Grexit from NATO and the EU, and I will going to throw the bases out and so on and so forth. So he gave him the room so that Andreas could backtrack from these promises and implement more pragmatic policies. And the agreement and how we reached the agreement on the basis was masterful. Of course, another good American diplomat, Bartholomew, played a very important role as being the negotiator. But I think the stage had been set by Monty, and they both gave Andreas a way of presenting the agreement as a victory to the Greek people, while at the same time, the agreement was a complete 168 degrees turnaround from his promises. So we were very fortunate that Monty had this subtlety, and he gave this room so that Andreas could backtrack from all the things that he had promised before the election.
If I could just add one other thing, Alan, in the book, Monty talks about the actual wording of the base agreement, in which it is the only agreement that he ever signed, or at least helped with, in which there is a slight change in the verbs. And in the translation. And in English, it says that the bases will be terminated if either side gives whatever time notice. And in Greek, it says that the bases will be. So, and then of course, both of them were actually kicking the can down the road, because who on earth knew what would happen to all of our bases? They were bones of contention in virtually every single country we had them in. And actually, as it turned out, the bases faded out because they weren't needed. Times had changed. The Cold War ended.
Well, Tony Stearns, Professor Arvanitopoulos, thank you very much on behalf of ADST and DACOR. We really appreciate your insight in this great discussion. I realize we want to be respectful of people's time, so we'll conclude officially. But just to note, Gifted Greek is available anywhere books are sold, on Amazon, for example. And it would be a great addition for foreign affairs scholars, practitioners, journalists, Hellenophiles, or anyone who appreciates a political biography with intriguing characters and mixed reputations. So I just want to mention finally, just please visit ADST.org, subscribe to our weekly newsletter. This recording will be made available on our YouTube channel. And remember that we want to always continue our mission to capture, preserve, and share the experiences of U.S. diplomats through events like these and others. Thanks again for joining us. Officially, the program has ended, but as is our tradition, you're welcome to stay on and chat. The recording will end very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.